The US has joined calls from Australia, Canada and New Zealand in warning Israel against a ground offensive in Rafah in southern Gaza. Anthony Albanese, Justin Trudeau and Christopher Luxon have released a statement declaring a military operation into Rafah would be catastrophic. Human rights attorney and CEO of the International Legal Forum, Arsen Ostrovsky, joins me now from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for your time. You have been a critic of Australia's response. Tell me why.
Thank you, first of all, for having me on this morning, Rita. I mean, look, Israel does not have the luxury that Australia does of being surrounded by water. Israel is surrounded by ruthless terrorist enemies like Hamas. Hamas is not like the Salvation Army. Hamas is a bloodthirsty jihadist terrorist group. On October 7th, they committed the most heinous atrocities, including massacring, raping, torturing, abducting women, children, the elderly. There are still over 130 people being held hostage in captivity in Gaza. Now, I think Australia has throughout the years shown incredible bipartisan support for Israel, but it is disappointing to see allies like Australia now undermine Israel's right to self-defense against this kind of heinous enemy that Israel is facing. This is not the time for equivocation. This is the time for mates to stand up, to show unequivocal support for your allies as you're facing this challenge.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the Biden administration. They have been weak, you could say. They're also calling for a temporary ceasefire and warning against a ground offensive by Israel in Rafah. Is there a sign of the US-Israeli relationship fracturing just a little?
Look, I'm not sure if it's fracturing. I think from the very beginning, the Biden administration, certainly in the early days, was incredible in the outpouring of support. And this is probably even more so given some of the internal challenges that President Biden has faced with an election year coming up. But I think it was inevitable that that the longer this campaign proceeds, the more casualties and destruction there is, that there would be differences between Israel and the US. And we're certainly seeing some of those arise now, including with respect to the operation in Rafah, with possible ceasefire, and certainly with some of the, I think, unfortunate statements perhaps they're saying in terms of, I think it was only just last week that President Biden indicated that perhaps Israel was going, I quote, over the top in its response in Gaza. I think that's certainly not Israel. Like Australia, like the US, will do anything and everything possible in order to rescue its hostages.
Now, in Europe, we've got Hungary, which is standing firm by Israel. The Jerusalem Post reports Hungary has twice blocked a European Union consensus statement against the IDF's military operations against Hamas in Rafah. The quote there from the senior diplomat is, "Hungary stood alone in the EU." Why do you think that is? Is there a special relationship between Israel and Hungary at the moment?
Look, I think Hungary just gets it. Simple as that. They understand the security threat that Israel is facing. They understand the strategic threat Israel is facing. They certainly have a keen awareness of history, and I think they have a firm belief in the power of democracies and sovereign nations to do as they need in order to thwart the security, very real security challenges they're facing. There's a lot of talk, as you noted, about Rafah, both in terms of what the Australian government has indicated with some of its pronouncements, the US and Europe now, in terms of trying to pass this resolution. But we have to remember that Israel wouldn't be going into Rafah if Hamas would just release the hostages and surrender. It is that simple. This can all end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders and releases the hostages. That is where the international community, including Australia, ought to be exerting pressure.
Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel is willing to go it alone if that's what needs to happen. Is that likely? Can you tell us about what the mood is like in Israel? Is there enormous pressure on Netanyahu to finish the job? And is he losing support at all?
Israel is a country where there is no shortage of disagreement. But on this, there is overwhelming consensus and unity from across not just the political spectrum, but people on the street as well. There is an expectation that Israel must do everything possible in order to not just defeat Hamas and rescue the hostages, but to ensure this will not and cannot ever happen again. The communities in the south cannot live with Hamas on the border, where this can repeat. Well, what we saw on October 7th will repeat again. So right now there is incredible support for the government, for the military forces to do everything necessary in order to rescue the hostages and to finally dismantle Hamas once and for all.
Now, before you go, we are seeing a worrying rise in anti-Semitism across the world. Your Legal Forum is a global coalition of lawyers combating anti-Semitism and terror. You're originally from Sydney. I do wonder, watching from afar, what you make of what's happening here. The Australian response from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, to the weekly protests that you're seeing in Melbourne and Sydney that are very much anti-Israel. What do you make of it all, watching from afar?
I have to tell you, it's depressing. This is not the Australia that I recall. This is not the Australia that I grew up in. I was proud to grow up in Sydney, in New South Wales, on the beaches. This is not the Australia that I remember. I never in my lifetime thought that I'd be reading and seeing headlines that the Jewish community is afraid, that anti-Semitism is rising from every which element, from radical Islamists, from the far left, from online. What we're seeing is disturbing. It is not only attacks against Jews as individuals, against swastikas, against Holocaust distortion. We're seeing scenes, in the Circular Quay and Harbour Bridge, gas the Jews. We are seeing not only the attacks against Jews, but also this anti-Semitism permeating and manifesting in attacks and vilification against the state of Israel as well. And this all has impact. Words have impacts. The scenes and violence does not happen in a vacuum. It is a direct result of this kind of pervasive discourse. And I think there needs to be certainly great onus on not just the political leadership to stamp this out, also the police and the authorities to tackle this without any kind of equivalence.
Well said, Arsen Ostrovsky. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rita.